In the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022, in the quiet town of Moscow, Idaho, 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, returned home from what seemed like an ordinary Saturday night. By morning, all 4 were dead, brutally murdered inside their off-campus home in a case that would shock the nation. For weeks, there were no suspects, no arrests, just fears, rumors, and a growing media frenzy. The hunt for the killer led investigators through digital breadcrumbs, surveillance footage, and what would become a controversial piece of DNA evidence. Until nearly 7 weeks later, a 28-year-old criminology PhD student named Bryan Kohberger was arrested, charged with the murders of all 4 students. I'm your host, Joshua Ritter, an award-winning Los Angeles prosecutor turned criminal defense attorney with over 15 years' experience navigating the criminal justice system. To help us break down this case from the very beginning, we're joined by someone who's been on the ground covering it from day one. Kevin Fixler is an investigative reporter with the Idaho Statesman who's been following every twist and turn in the Kohberger case with a dogged tenacity rarely seen, digging into court documents, speaking with sources, and reporting from inside the courtroom. Please join us for this very special presentation of Courtroom Confidential Case Notes. Here's what we know about the hours leading up to the murders. 4 victims: Kaylee Goncalves, age 21, Madison Mogen, also 21, Xana Kernodle, age 20, and Ethan Chapin, also 20, spent that Saturday night like many college students do in a small town.
The 5 young women who lived in that property, they were all out and about on the town that evening, November 12th. It was the last home football game for the Idaho Vandals, and Kaylee Goncalves, she had actually moved out of that house and was down visiting to see her friends and to almost show off her new vehicle, a Range Rover that she had purchased. And they all went out. A couple or a few of them went to the football game. And then, as happens in small college towns and communities where there's limited activities outside of maybe school events and so forth, they went out on the town. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen, the best friends since they were very young, up out of North Idaho. They ended up at a bar called the Corner Club, which is widely known around Moscow and the region, and ended up at a food truck that parks nearby called the Grub Truck. And there's video that was released very early in that showed them there kind of horsing around with friends or whatever briefly while they await their order. And then off they went in some sort of rideshare type pickup and then got back to the house about 2 a.m. is what we've been told. The other 2 surviving roommates, they also got back in around 2 a.m. They were, I believe, out separately. And then Xana Kernodle, the other young woman who lived at the property, and her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, they were at the Sigma Chi fraternity house, which was about 300 yards from this property where they lived, and walked across the field and also made it back by about 2 a.m. We know that not everybody went immediately to sleep. That was actually a point of contention pretty early in. The coroner had said they all died in their sleep, and that turned out not to be true. So some misinformation that got out into the public and had to be corrected through follow-up statements and, again, the probable cause affidavit. And we certainly know they weren't asleep now. Xana Kernodle was, I believe she ordered takeout food via DoorDash at 4 a.m. about. And so that was dropped off. And then at 4:12 a.m., she, based on data, was still on her TikTok account. And that's, to some extent, how police were constructing the timeline. They, of course, saw a white vehicle. They believe it to be a white Hyundai Elantra in the neighborhood shortly before 4 a.m. and then right after, based on some video footage from a neighbor's home. And then now we have these text messages from the surviving roommates that show that one of them heard what she thought was Kaylee on the 3rd floor where her bedroom was and where Madison Mogen's bedroom was, playing with her dog. Kaylee shared a dog with her ex-boyfriend who lived around the corner, and she thought she heard noises upstairs that she was playing around with her dog at a certain point and was sort of checking on that. And then she thought she heard crying from the room over, which would have been Xana Kernodle's room, and had repeatedly opened her door to see what was happening. And then the third time she opened her door to explore what was happening in the home, which was a party house, and things happened late. It probably wasn't atypical that there would be loud noises or, people up at least. She reported that she saw someone in all black, a mask over their face and mouth, and walking toward her, actually. A latest court filing from the defense actually suggests that the individual in the homes who she wasn't familiar with was as close as 3 feet away before she closed the door, locked it, and presumably the individual exited, although she says she doesn't know from what point of the home. We still don't know the entry point or the exit point. I mean, there's a lot of details we still really don't know. And then through these text messages, we learned that the second floor roommate then texted with the downstairs roommate on the first floor, and at some point shortly thereafter raced down, and they spent the night together.
As this case has progressed, we've learned new information through unsealed court filings, providing missing pieces of the timeline that help fill in what happened inside that house in the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022. One of the more significant revelations came in March of 2025 when a February motion filed by prosecutors was unsealed, revealing the text messages exchanged between the surviving roommates, identified in court documents by their initials DM and BF. From 422 to 424, the roommates sent the following messages. DM to BF, no one is answering. I'm really confused right now. DM to Goncalves, Kaylee, what's going on? BF to DM, yeah dude, WTF. Xana was wearing all black. DM to BF, I'm freaking out right now. No, it's like ski mask almost. BF to DM, STFU. Actually, DM to BF, like he had something over his forehead and little and mouth. BF, I'm not kidding. I'm so freaked out. BF to DM, so am I. DM to BF, my phone is going to die. BF to DM, come to my room. Run. Down here. Hours later, we find the following exchange starting at 10:23 a.m., nearly an hour and a half before the now infamous 911 call. DM to Goncalves, please answer. DM to Mogen, are you up? And finally, DM to Goncalves, are you up? As revealing as the messages are, they're just one piece of the puzzle. To really understand this case and why the investigation unfolded the way it did, we have to talk about the house itself. Because this wasn't just any off-campus rental. The layout, the entrances, and even where each person was located that night, all of it played a role in what happened. And in the questions investigators and the public have wrestled with ever since. You realize that the house itself plays a very important role here. First of all, its proximity to the college, I think, is important. The neighborhood in which it's located, there's a lot of other student housing and, like you said, fraternity homes in that neighborhood. But it's houses, correct? It's houses that have been converted into kind of student living and fraternity homes rather than being built by the college, I guess is what I'm saying. And then the structure of the home itself, that there's several different floors. If you could kind of explain a little bit of that to us, particularly too, because the home has now been destroyed, which is been a very controversial action that was taken. So talk to us a little bit about both of those things, if you could.
My first trip up there, I was so surprised at how central this particular home was to that neighborhood. There was a lot of apartments just to the left of it, and also just below it. It almost sat on a hill to some extent. And it's a couple dead-end streets over there. There's King and Queen Road, and this sat on King, even though it was kind of a flag property. So that was even a little curious. Some people thought it was Queen Road that this home was on. And it being known as a party house, there was like a noise funnel that it created, and it was sent up the hill. It's almost, again, it sat kind of in this plateau, and then there's a valley, or the valley rather, and then it would send it up the cliffs. And in the past, people had actually complained about noise issues at that particular home. So that was pretty interesting too, the noise elements that either were at play or could have been at play in this whole thing. It's not on campus. It's not a campus property. But what it is that neighborhood is basically run off to the Greek life. And so after people wrap up either their freshman or sophomore years living in their respective sorority or fraternity houses, a lot of them would tend to move to this neighborhood. The home itself, even in a recent court filing from the state, they talk about how it's an unorthodox property. And that's, I think, putting it lightly. It's a very unique home, or at least it was, where the first floor is basically the walk up from the driveway. And then from there, as you walk around the back side, there's a sliding glass door, which is immediately the second floor. And then the third floor had a balcony that had no stairs. And so it was just from that third floor, you could exit a different sliding glass door and you'd be on the balcony and could oversee the neighborhood a little bit from the back side. There's two bedrooms on each floor and a bathroom on each floor as well. So six bedroom, 3 bathroom. And even establishing in the early days which victim was on which floor, those were still details that even police had wrong. They gave us incorrect information very early in. And we still don't know exactly where everyone was. One of the rooms was vacant because a young woman who had previously signed on to the lease never actually moved in. Ultimately, we found out, and I mean, this is kind of, again, the chaos of the whole situation. We learned that Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen were found in the same bed from her father at the memorial. So information like that, key details that I think police were trying to hold back in case they came upon a perpetrator or someone they wanted to interview. Nobody would know that except for police and the individual or individuals they were after. And this was the kind of information that was just seeping out in odd moments, including at a memorial for the students.
I'm guessing you never had an opportunity to actually go inside the home. Is that correct?
I was never in the home. I was up there a couple weeks after the incident. We had set my colleague, Angela, and, it was clearly taped off by police, and I was never previously in that property. But I'll tell you, there's so many people. You'll talk to people all over the state, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, I used to party there," or "I had my husband used to live there." There's so many people who have come in through that home. It's a private rental that was privately owned, and then ultimately, you talked about it being deconstructed. The owner gave it to the university to decide ultimately what to do with it once police and investigators were done with it. And there was a stipulated agreement between the defense and the prosecution that it was no longer needed. They did all sorts of 3D imaging and had the FBI in repeatedly. And as you said, controversially, the property came down against the desires of 2 or possibly as many as 3 of the families.
The reason I ask is because of some of the curious behavior of the surviving students, and they've come under a lot of criticism, and I think very unfairly. But a lot of people are very confused by the fact that they didn't hear more, the fact that they didn't react differently, that it wasn't until nearly noon before they start making 911 calls. And I feel like the construction of that home, that there are people living on different floors, may have played a role in that, especially when you start to consider things like you said, acoustics, what could be heard throughout that home. Would you know if someone else was inside that home? And being kind of a party home with people in and out, would that even raise alarms that they heard people at odd hours of the night either coming and going from that home? Are you able to lay out who was where in the home as far as we know?
You raised some good questions about the noise and the acoustics of the home, and now with it no longer being there, that won't be available for jurors to walk through if that was something they sought. The trial is obviously now down in Boise, so it's a long trip to get there, even if it was still standing. But to your point, yes. So the surviving roommate on the first floor was in her room. There was no other roommate on the first floor. On the second floor, you had Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin, who was staying over for the night. Also on that second floor, you had the other second floor roommate who survived and ultimately stayed the night in the first floor roommate's room. And then upstairs, you had Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves' rooms. And ultimately, those two were found each stabbed to death in Madison Mogen's room.
Understanding the house is critical, but what happened inside the next morning is what's left so many with lingering questions. The surviving girls in the home now realize something is wrong, and they may have realized something was wrong before, but now they're becoming very concerned, and they're starting to call 911. And as you mentioned, the 911 call has been released, and it seems to present even more questions.
911 location of your emergency.
Something is happening. Something happened in our house. We don't know what.
What is the address of the emergency?
1122.
What is the rest of the address?
Oh, Kings Road.
Okay. And is that a house or an apartment?
It's a house.
Can you repeat the address to make sure that I have it right?
I'll talk to you guys. We live at the White, so we're next to them.
I need someone to repeat the address for verification.
The address, 1122 King Road.
And what's the phone number that you're calling from?
What's your phone number?
And tell me exactly what's going on.
One of the roommates has passed out, and she was drunk last night, and she's not waking up.
Okay.
Oh, and they saw some man in their house last night. Yeah.
And are you with the patient? Okay, I need someone to keep the phone, stop passing it around.
Can I just tell you what happened pretty much?
What is going on currently? Is someone passed out right now?
I don't really know, but pretty much at 4 a.m.
Okay, I need to know what's going on right now if someone is passed out. Can you find that out?
Yeah, I'll come. Come on, but we gotta go check. But we have to. Is he passed out? She's not waking up.
Okay, one moment. I'm getting help started that way.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and how old is she?
She's 20.
20, you said?
Yes, 20 here.
Okay.
Hello? Hello?
Okay, I need someone to stop passing the phone around because I've talked to 4 different people.
Okay, sorry, they just gave me the phone.
Is she breathing?
Hello?
Is she breathing?
No.
Okay.
You need to talk to them, okay? I can't talk to them. They need you to talk to them.
Hello.
Okay. I've already sent the ambulance and law enforcement. Stay on the line. If there is a defibrillator available, send someone to get it now and tell me when you have it.
Say that again. There's a police here right now.
Okay. If there's a defibrillator available, send someone to get it now and tell me when you have it.
We don't have one. I think yes. Do you have a defibrillator? Yes, you have one.
Are you talking to the officer?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to let you go since he's there with you and can help you.
Okay.
One of the things that is curious is they don't seem to know that the other 4 are dead. In fact, they're telling 911 that you need to get out here. They're not waking up, and they talk about they had been drinking the night before. Can you talk to us a little bit about that phone call and what has been learned from it?
Right. So the second floor roommate was on the line, and you can just tell that she's frantic. And, before they went to bed, down on the first floor. And then even in the morning, they were calling and texting the other 3 roommates, and then also Chapin's cell phone. Nobody picked up. Tragically, we know why now. And I think they were very confused. And, from some court filings, we know that there's an allegation that the second floor roommate was drunk and acknowledges to police in several interviews that she was very tired and I think just very confused. And by the morning, they make this phone call, and it's not clear, as you say, there are more questions now that we have, but it's not clear that anyone had actually entered any of the rooms. And I think she's starting to realize that it was a reality that she saw this person in the home, and nobody can be accounted for at this point. The belief is that the initial bodies are discovered basically live on the call. And they must have called a friend over, and it was one of Ethan Chapin's friends, and then I believe his girlfriend. And I think live on that call, you can hear as he enters the room and calls for Xana and Ethan's names and says something about, it's me, basically. And, they don't respond. And then all you hear is a male voice say, "Get out, get out, get out." And that's basically, I think he starts to understand that at least something is way off.
Shortly after the call became public, Kaylee Goncalves' family issued this statement. As we continue to process the 911 call, we just wanted to share some of our thoughts. We stand together with all the victims of Idaho, both those we have lost and those who remain, forever marked by a tragedy that no passage of time will ever erase. After hearing that call, one thing is clear. Hunter, with his quiet, stoic resolve, protected those girls from a nightmare that no one should ever be forced to witness. He stepped into the abyss, shielding them from horrors that will haunt him forever. In closing, let us face the uncomfortable truth. Had the 911 call been made the moment the accused left the house, it would not have saved anyone. Nothing would have changed. So we ask respectfully, please do not waste your energy pointing fingers at those who could not have prevented it. The anger, the grief, the pain, they must all be focused on one thing, one person, the one who stole the innocence of Moscow that night. We demand justice, and that cause is all that matters now. In the hours and days that followed, investigators worked with a frenzied intensity to piece together what happened, launching a manhunt that would grip the small town of Moscow and quickly draw national attention. Let's take a look at how that investigation unfolded. During these weeks following the murders, now the public knows 4 college students have been stabbed to death. There's no suspect. This person is at large. This is a small community. The college is a huge part of it. What was the atmosphere? What was the effect on that community knowing that this murderer is still on the loose?
Again, so November 13th, let's take us back just a couple weeks before Thanksgiving. Many students just cut down. It was kind of a ghost town. And when I first got up there, I noticed that as well, certainly, that just ahead of break, many people left early. They were, it is a tight-knit community and also a tight-knit college community. And many people knew these young women and Chapin. They were socialites around campus. They were well known within the Greek life community there, which is also fairly tight-knit. And I think people were just devastated. And so they got out of town early for the Thanksgiving break. And then I do recall that some students didn't come back for the end of the semester. And I believe the university made accommodations so that people could finish tests and finals and papers and so forth, remote. And then there was many questions on whether or not they would ever come back to the University of Idaho. And that really became an issue too. There was a silence in a place that's otherwise usually pretty lively, particularly on weekends. And, it's cliche, but I believe it to be true. This is a place where people didn't lock their doors. It's a rural community. People didn't lock their car doors. They didn't lock their homes. And I did meet with people, particularly those who lived around the property, who had told me, I'm using a door jamb now. Everybody was, very concerned. And that also became a big issue early in because police had said that they believe it was a targeted attack without ever explaining that. and they said, the public was generally safe, essentially. And then they couldn't offer any information as to explain why they came to that conclusion, both that it was targeted and that they didn't believe that this was someone on the loose and might be a violent offender who might repeat.
Were there theories beginning to circulate as to, what was behind this, why they were targeted? I have to imagine that when it goes unsolved for that long and it's got so much attention on it, that those types of theories are going to start to arise.
Well, sure. And so, again, I recall the Latah County prosecutor being on TV and saying, repeating that statement that they believed it to be targeted. But then it became this question, well, was it the home that was targeted or was it a specific individual? There had been rumors, and, I don't play in that sandbox, but there had been beliefs that maybe Chapin had been involved in some sort of fight at the fraternity where he was at. And those proved to be unfounded as far as I understand. There was a thought that perhaps it was Kaylee Goncalves who had been targeted, and her family had released information that her body actually had been more violently damaged. I don't remember the exact language, but the family had released information that had not yet been out through police or some authority that she had been treated worse by whomever had done this. And then there was long talk that perhaps it was Madison Mogen who was targeted. Again, as far as we know, none of that is founded, and we to this day still don't really know. This is the question we always want to know with something like this, the why. What
information was starting to be shared with the public? How was the investigation beginning to develop? Because I know that department fell under some criticism because no one was apprehended immediately, and people were beginning to question whether or not they were up to the task. But it sounds like they were very busy behind the scenes.
Not to use a double negative here, but it wasn't not immediately. It was nearly 2 months. That if listeners, viewers, readers want to think back to it, people who followed the case or not, it was nearly 7 weeks before there was an arrest, December 30th, and very confusingly, it was on the opposite side of the country in eastern Pennsylvania. But in those, the biggest piece of information that came out after some weeks was that police were looking for what they believed was a white Hyundai Elantra. The years were 2011 to 2013. They believed to have been in the vicinity, was the language, of the home in those early morning hours. And that's all they would release. They didn't say it was a suspect vehicle. They wouldn't say any more than that. They just believed that somebody who was in that vehicle or more than one person had information about the crime. And so they asked the public for tips, and they set up a tip hotline, and basically to report any white Hyundai Elantra that you have seen in the region. And so you had tips coming in from Oregon and Washington and obviously Idaho. I mean, I can't remember how many they had, but it was tens of thousands of vehicles that they were combing through to try to understand who may have owned this vehicle. So they were kind of saying it without saying it, but they also wouldn't speak to who may have been behind the wheel or in the vehicle.
I remember during that time, and I'm not sure if it was when they first started asking for help from the public or if it came later, but there was it looked like stills from surveillance video that was being released of what the vehicle looked like as well. Did they ever explain where they got the idea that this white Hyundai Elantra might be involved during that time, or was it just like, be on the lookout for this?
So those stills actually were not released by police. There was follow-up video from the neighborhood that eventually showed, and that was kind of a leak of some kind to the public, but no, it was a general kind of bolo. And again, it was to send in information about any vehicle you saw. And so, you had neighbors calling on neighbors, and I'm sure it was people who know each other for a long time. And this is not a vehicle that's hard to find. It's pretty universally owned. We did, of course, learn later that the FBI expert who was using surveillance video to understand what make and model extended the window from 2011 to 2016 because those two different slight models of the Hyundai Elantra were very similar. By the way, that was never information that they ever released to the public, even though they knew. They later knew that it was more likely between the 2014 and 2016 model year. They never released that to the public, ultimately before they arrested Bryan Kohberger in eastern Pennsylvania.
The white Hyundai Elantra became a critical focus early on, helping detectives narrow their investigation. But in the end, it was one piece of evidence that would ultimately lead investigators to their final suspect in the case. It was DNA, specifically a single piece of trace evidence left behind that would become the most direct link between Bryan Kohberger and the murders. Here's how that developed.
If you really read the probable cause affidavit, you'll believe that it's this deep investigation that they start here and they end there, and a lot that happens in between. The thing that's missing, and that even a former FBI agent told me later on, it was pretty clear that there was a huge detail missing, and that was that DNA was found on a knife sheath, as we know now today, next to Madison Mogen's body, and on that they found DNA, and they tried to match it through the CODIS system, the national database of DNA that is overseen by the FBI, and never got a hit. And so they turned to ancestry websites, and we've, of course, more famously seen this used in the Golden State Killer case to solve that crime and find the suspect. And that's exactly what they did here, but they didn't include that information, the use of investigative genetic genealogy, some people call it forensic genetic genealogy, to settle on a family tree and begin to build toward, through public records and any other data and information that police have access to, and the public in many regards, and determine that there was one person from that family lineage who lived in the area, happened to live 9 miles west in Pullman, Washington, and that's where they set their sights. Ultimately, they did a trash pull at the Kohberger property in Pennsylvania. They found DNA that turned out to be Kohberger's father, and the way that they matched it was the DNA on the knife sheath was that of the male child, is how it was written into the affidavit. And then ultimately they did a direct cheek swab with Bryan Kohberger upon his arrest, and also when he came to Idaho, when they transferred him here. And according to the state, it matches directly to the DNA found on the knife sheath button snap.
In the past few weeks, newly released court documents have revealed even more eye-opening evidence prosecutors say tie Kohberger to the crime. According to court filings, investigators obtained a search warrant which, quote, directed law enforcement to seize from Amazon.com Bryan Kohberger's customer click activity pertaining to knives and accessories. The results? 8 months before the murders, Kohberger allegedly purchased a K-bar military knife, sheath, and sharpener, matching the sheath found at the crime scene. The warrant covered his Amazon history from March 20th of 2022 through March 30th, a matter of months before the murders. Kevin, safe to say that the DNA evidence here is the linchpin of the prosecution's entire case. I mean, I even wonder whether or not they would have brought charges if it were not for that DNA that was recovered from the scene. And you just explained to us that they actually knew about this DNA, but had not released that to the public, but had begun this work on this IGG type investigation. Do we know how early on they were able to identify Bryan Kohberger as a possible suspect?
I believe through the DNA, they say it was December 19th, and then ultimately he was arrested on the 30th. So, essentially a month after, I guess almost 5 weeks after the crime, they discovered the knife sheath pretty quickly. And then it was within days that they had found that it had DNA on it. And they developed that at an Idaho State Police crime lab that's down here closer to Boise. That's where the state police gets involved. And then ultimately the FBI got involved. They took over the IGG component. The DNA initially went to a private lab out of Texas called Offram Labs, and they began the DNA IGG process. I won't get into the technical elements, but you have to you have to create a certain type of profile, and then they got fairly close to learning the family lineage. What we have now learned was that police use two ancestry databases that police have access to. There's approval, and they also access two DNA databases that they do not. And the defense tried to mount a case in order to get the information tossed, saying that police essentially had skirted policies set by the Department of Justice, but the state was able to successfully argue that those were basically breaking terms of condition, not someone's constitutional rights, under a belief that they have privacy rights either to evidence left behind at a crime scene, including DNA, nor to the DNA of a distant relative.
So if they were able to identify him earlier on than we at first thought, you had mentioned he travels across the country at one point. Him and his father take a road trip from Washington all the way to Pennsylvania, where he's eventually apprehended. That's where the family home was. Do we know if during that time he was under surveillance by law enforcement?
The FBI says they were not. And the timeline by which we understand that they were able to confirm through IgG that the DNA was his on the sheath, purportedly, allegedly, they were not aware of who Bryan Kohberger was. The Washington State Campus Police had put Kohberger's vehicle on a list of the Hyundai Elantras, I believe as far back as November 29th, they discovered it. But that alone is not at all how they discovered who he was. They were able to sort of triangulate information once they received a quote unquote tip from the FBI to investigate this guy after the IgG process that they undertook.
The IgG process has not been without controversy, and the defense has challenged this heavily, and no surprise there. Again, if we go back to this idea that DNA is the linchpin of the prosecution's entire case, in my view, the defense either has to challenge that legally, its admission as evidence, or somehow provide an innocent explanation for why their client's DNA ends up on that knife sheath. And we'll get into those theories later. But first, as far as their legal attacks, they are not without some merit, correct? There was some things done by the FBI that have been certainly questionable. Could you walk us through that?
Yeah, the defense and the prosecution duked it out for, I think it was about 7 months, over even just access to these records. The FBI apparently didn't keep very close records of the way in which they went through this process, which actually also goes against DOJ policy. And when the defense was seeking through the discovery process any records about how they came to settle on Bryan Kohberger as the suspect, they were missing a lot of information. Ultimately, the judge up in Moscow did award, after in-camera review of Idaho State Police Crime Lab, private lab data, and also what the FBI was willing to cough up, they did turn that over, and the judge ruled in favor of the defense and gave the majority of those records over to the defense. I spoke with a IgG expert, and he actually told me this was the most the most in terms of records that any defense has ever gotten on this process in a case like this. As we know, this is a developing technology used more often in active investigations rather than simply cold cases anymore. And so they had access, and they could see the ways in which ultimately the FBI went about this process. And later in sealed filings, they alleged that Bryan Kohberger's constitutional rights had been violated because they had, again, at least broken terms of service on what databases they could access in order to review people's private genetic information and ultimately to build a family tree that led them to Bryan Kohberger. They eventually confirmed it with direct matches, according to them, and allegedly. But ultimately, that was thrown out by the current judge down here in Boise as well after a very thorough review and oral arguments.
Ultimately, the prosecution is not going into this case relying on that IgG evidence. that may have been the investigatory tool which led them to Bryan Kohberger. But then once he was in custody, they did a swab on him, a direct swab of him, and were able to match that, according to them, directly to him. So that is going to be the evidence they're actually going to introduce at trial. While the DNA was arguably the most major break in the case, it wasn't the only piece investigators were working with. They also built a case around circumstantial evidence, cell phone records, surveillance footage, and one of the most haunting details, the surviving roommate's description of a masked man with bushy eyebrows seen inside the house that night. Let's break down how all that came together.
The FBI submits this tip to local police, the city police, and also to Idaho State Police. And from there, they basically try to build the case backwards. They're basically solving for X, which, many constitutional rights attorneys and believers will say is the wrong way to go about an investigation. But obviously, things are evolving in that world. But they then file for warrants and learn Bryan Kohberger's alleged whereabouts at the time. And they discover that his cell phone, they believe, was either off or in airplane mode, something along those lines. And, it populates first in Pullman, Washington. It's headed east toward Moscow before it shuts off. Again, this is all alleged by police. And then ultimately it was off until almost 5 o'clock, where it repopulates on a back road that ultimately leads back to Pullman. So they know he's out and about. I mean, that's at the very least what we know. What's also interesting, and many have pointed this out, it's the only time that his phone was off during that period. Happens to be around the time of this crime. And then once they knew that was his vehicle type, again, the FBI expert later expanded the year window of the type of vehicle. They also used surveillance footage from the neighborhood, and then also public cameras around Pullman and Moscow to discover what they believe to be the path to and from back to his apartment in Pullman, Washington, 9 miles west.
Now, one other piece of evidence, there is no quote unquote eyewitness to this crime, but we do have the one roommate who is able to identify someone in that home. And when I say identify, I mean give us a general description of a male, general height, wearing all black, face covered, so that we're never going to have a moment in court where someone identifies Bryan Kohberger. But interestingly, and just another, cut of the 1,000 cuts that the prosecution is going to use in this case, is that the one identifying feature is that she says that this person had bushy eyebrows. How do you feel that plays into the prosecution's case?
Well, let's see first if that makes it to trial. The defense is trying to throw that out via a motion in limine, and that's currently being debated before the court. The state actually just issued their response filing, and then there'll be a response to that and ultimately oral arguments on that on April 9th is what that's scheduled for. But interestingly, in that filing, the defense says that Bryan Kohberger doesn't have bushy eyebrows. And so they're arguing it's irrelevant, and yet it will also, if someone gets on the stand to testify, and it is believed these two survivors will do that, according to the state, even just saying that in court will give jurors the idea that he has been positively ID'd by this person, even though that roommate has also said repeatedly she could not pick someone out of a lineup. And then ultimately, when she was shown a photo of Bryan Kohberger, according to the defense, she could not positively say that it was him. So we'll see if that detail makes it in. We can debate back and forth whether or not Bryan Kohberger has bushy eyebrows. But that is a detail that people do recall and was cited all the way back to the probable cause affidavit.
Recently released court documents expose efforts by the defense to exclude the surviving roommate's description of a masked man with bushy eyebrows, claiming her account is unreliable because she had been drinking that night, and that, quote, bushy eyebrows by itself is not enough of a description to qualify as evidence. The response from prosecutors gives us one of the most chilling pieces of evidence released in this case to date. Arguing that jurors should decide for themselves if the bushy eyebrows description is accurate, the prosecution introduced a selfie from Kohberger's phone, taken hours after the murders, an image that clearly shows his eyebrows. But it also leaves us with a haunting image of a man authorities believe is just moments removed from a nightmarish quadruple homicide. Days after the release of the selfie photo, prosecutors released another shocking detail. Records showing Kohberger purchased a black balaclava mask 11 months before the killings. They say the purchase, made at a Dick's Sporting Goods in Pittsburgh, corroborates the surviving roommate's chilling account of a masked intruder inside the house. All of the evidence, physical, circumstantial, and otherwise, ultimately led investigators to one man, Bryan Kohberger. On December 30th, 2022, Kohberger was arrested at his parents' home in Pennsylvania, charged as a fugitive from justice, and quickly extradited back to Idaho. By January 5th, 2023, Kohberger is formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. That May 17th, a grand jury handed down an official indictment on all charges. But who is Bryan Kohberger? And how does someone like him end up at the center of a case like this? Let's take a look at what we know about his background.
Shortly after Bryan Kohberger was arrested, I took a trip to eastern Pennsylvania to get out and about his community and where he grew up, and to learn what I could about him. Incredibly, I found it actually to be a very similar place to Moscow, fairly rural, built around a school system. He has 2 sisters. They also went there, and both of his parents worked. And I learned from community members more about the family in the neighborhood they initially moved to, and then also eventually the other neighborhood they moved to, which was a gated community where the police raid took place. Their large property is about an acre apiece. And so, you know the people next to you, but only to the extent that they basically want you to. And in speaking with neighbors and people who rode the school bus with him, growing up, they told me that he was a fairly socially awkward kid. He was quite overweight. And, I think he was pretty self-conscious about that. Over time, as he got into high school, he took up kickboxing was something that he did, and running, and lost a lot of weight. And people remember the dramatic weight loss that he underwent. If memory serves, it was between his junior and senior year. He had desires on entering the military and then ultimately law enforcement. He was in a technical program through the high school that he attended, where he was learning about how to enter law enforcement. Interestingly, he was actually kicked out of that program for reasons we don't quite know. I had mined a source out there, someone who was his counselor at the time, who gave me some details about that, but because of federal education restrictions, was not able to detail the specifics of that. But the other really stark thing that I learned out there was Bryan Kohberger developed a heroin habit. Heroin is a fairly a significant issue in what was Pennsylvania coal country, that region. And I think a lot of it funnels in from New York. And it wasn't uncommon that people in that high school had developed these drug habits. I later learned through my reporting that he had several high school friends, people who he used to shoot up with, who also had died later from heroin addiction. And so he overcame that. I mean, that's actually really impressive. You don't see a lot of people who kick their opioid addictions. He ultimately did, and then entered the local community college, Northampton. He got his associate's degree in psychology, and then moved on to get his BA, or I guess it would have been a BS, from DeSales University. And then he did primarily his online program for his master's in psychology from DeSales University as well, focused on, I think he started to develop into some criminology, criminal justice type work. And then ultimately he lands in the PhD program at Washington State University in the criminal justice and criminology program. where he spent a semester before this incident. He was ultimately kicked out, or would not have been asked to return. He lost his TA job, according to a report from the New York Times, over issues he was having with some of the faculty. He's someone who, I don't know, a bit of a loner, it sounds. I mean, he did have friends, so I do want to be clear about that. I spoke to several of these people. They don't consider him a friend today, but they were regular kids. They were out in the woods. They were, fishing. They were playing video games. I mean, that's the type of person he was. And they kind of lost touch over the years, and then he kind of moved on with his life, just as they had as well.
In recent days, prosecutors have revealed that they will seek to introduce one of Kohberger's academic papers as evidence. The 12-page paper, written in 2020 while he was a graduate student at DeSales University, examines a case where a woman was stabbed to death in a trailer park. It is unclear if the case described is real or hypothetical, but prosecutors argue it bears striking similarities to the Idaho murders, including the use of a knife, surveillance footage, and forensic DNA collection. How prosecutors intend to use this during trial remains to be seen. Have you spoken to anyone who was in contact with him during the time leading up to the murders or shortly thereafter that can give any insight into a change in personality or stress levels or anything like that might indicate someone who was, about to commit this horrible crime?
Not really. I mean, that's actually part of the challenge. I did speak with a neighbor at the Washington State apartment complex where he lived, the student housing, a fellow graduate student. And he told me that he met Kohberger just in passing on the property. He said that they got to know each other a little bit. And one time he ran into Kohberger and he said, "Hey, do you want to go for a walk?" And he said, "Yeah, okay." Basically just to get to know him. And they just went ahead and circled the grounds, basically the parking lot. It's a big apartment complex, and he told me we just walked that property for over an hour, and just getting to know each other. But just essentially think about like doing track circles, basically. But they were just walking, the pavements, and then ultimately he told him like, "Hey, I gotta run. I got other stuff I gotta do." But he said that Kohberger made a comment once about weekend partying and how people were all wasting their time. I think he was not particularly interested in the social dynamics of college. And granted, a PhD program is different than undergraduate, but I just don't think that was the experience he had going to commuter schools and then also doing a lot of online coursework. And I think he was probably seeking some connections, and said he was a hiker, and his defense team will tell you he would drive around at night as a habit, and he was an avid runner and would go look at the moon and the stars at night, according to the alibi that they've issued, or the so-called alibi anyway. And I think he did a lot of things alone. That's my sense of him.
Following the murders and before any arrests are made, there has been a lot of chatter about people being suspicious about certain social media accounts or accounts in chat rooms that people believe may have been Bryan Kohberger, and showing an interest or at least following the investigation. Can you share with us any insights into that?
He has a neurological disorder that some refer to as visual snow, and it's essentially where, I'm dating myself maybe a little, but the old TV, when you would turn it on and it would be fuzzy, and it apparently has pretty dramatic visual effects on people, and it can also lead to ringing in the ears. And so it's pretty awful for people who have it. And so an account that was believed to be his, and pretty confidently was posting about having this disorder and trying to understand it for many, many years before he changed his diet. Bryan Kohberger is a vegan and is very mindful. I mean, probably pretty difficult in jail now to be extremely mindful of your diet, but even reports that he demanded his parents not use the same pans for meat as those that would serve him things, cooked in the same pots and pans.
As investigators and the public learned more about Bryan Kohberger's background, one question kept coming up. Was there any connection between him and the victims? Kohberger's defense insists there was no connection and no clear motive. But the families, especially Kaylee Goncalves' parents, believe there's more to the story. In an interview with 48 Hours, Steve and Christy Goncalves shared screenshots of an Instagram account they believe belonged to Kohberger. According to them, that account followed both Kaylee and Madison Mogen. The account mysteriously disappeared shortly after Kohberger's arrest, on the same day as a celebration of life for Kaylee and Maddie. While 48 Hours could not independently verify the account, it raises a question that has troubled many from the start. Why?
Nothing has ever been corroborated to prove that any account that Bryan Kohberger was attached to was following or messaging any of the four victims, particularly the three women. And so, and that aligns with his defense team saying that he has no provable connection to these individuals whatsoever. And so if that's information that is accurate, it's going to come out at trial and be something that the state has. But as far as I can see so far from filings from the state, they are not planning to rely upon Facebook, Instagram, TikTok accounts in order to show any specific link or connection between Bryan Kohberger and the four victims. Now, the latest is that his defense is saying that he's on the autism spectrum, and as a result, he should be precluded from the death penalty. I think all of these neurological disorders are all probably connected. I'm no expert on any of this, but we're going to see if a new precedent may be set. It is important to note that the autism spectrum is not a mental health issue, which would be probably the marker for whether or not any of these arguments will hold up legally, but rather it's a neurological disorder, and we'll see how that plays out in court.
As we learn more about who Bryan Kohberger is, his background, education, and the complex picture emerging about his life, the focus now turns to what comes next. The case is headed toward an August 2025 trial date. From Kohberger's arrest to the charges filed against him, every step has been closely scrutinized. And as the legal process plays out, the focus is shifting to what evidence will be presented in court and what challenges lie ahead for both sides. Kevin, let's now turn to the litigation that has taken place leading up to trial. And I will say his attorneys have been very aggressive, very litigious. They are certainly can be said to not leaving any stone unturned. And that has started from very early on. And a lot of it has been aimed at the death penalty. It seems as though most of their efforts are trying to have that removed from a possibility in this case. But really, they've gone after everything. And I want to start first with the idea that even venue was challenged early on. And we're no longer trying this case in the community where the murders took place, but like you said, 6 hours away in the capital of Boise. Could you talk to us a little bit about what their concerns were, how uncommon a decision is that to move a case of this magnitude so far away?
We have very famously the Daybell cases, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow Daybell. Those two cases, the murders they committed, and I can say that because they've been convicted, happened on East Idaho, and those two cases also moved to Boise. And so I think there's some precedent in Idaho that Boise is essentially the venue where these national cases make the most sense for playing out, both logistically and they're far enough away. You have the largest jury pool. The county where this is going to take place, where Boise is located, has the largest population in the state. The argument, of course, was that Bryan Kohberger could not get a fair trial based on the jury pool in Latah County, which is where Moscow is located. That community is about 40,000 people. I think registered voters is something like 25,000. And so that's kind of a derivative for the number of potential jurors who could be called. But don't kid yourself. Everybody in Moscow and in the state of Idaho And, many across the nation have heard about this case, and whether or not they're following it closely enough, they're probably familiar with the name Bryan Kohberger. And so ultimately that judge made the call that, yes, there's been extreme media publicity. I don't think we would dispute that. And he made the choice to move the case. Ultimately, the decision on where it went to the Idaho Supreme Court, and they moved it to Boise, and also made the call on which judge. And now we have Judge Stephen Hippler. We all had a lot of questions about that decision. And I recall the judge, the district judge, the original one in the case, he said that it was probably the hardest decision in his professional career. And then ultimately we came to find out he called it a career. He retired after 40 years in law.
It was enough to push him out the door, I guess, just the possibility of even presiding over that case. Again, we mentioned this, but the death penalty has his defense team have tried to challenge this in more ways than one. Can you walk us through some of their efforts? Because some of them are I would say very novel in their approach to trying to convince a judge to remove that as a possibility.
Sure. Well, your legal eagles have probably heard the term evolving standards of decency. That's one they attempted to lean in on. They tried to argue that it violates international law. I think the U.S. is not particularly interested in being told what types of sentencing are available within the United States. It was a broad variety of arguments. The latest, of course, is this autism argument, which has no precedent across the United States. They're trying to argue that it should be applied to beliefs that a mental health issue would preclude the death penalty. I think, again, some of your legal scholars who watch will know that typically that's affiliated with a low IQ, and that's not really what's perceived about Bryan Kohberger. Again, he was a PhD student and someone who was very focused on learning how police forensics operate. You got to be pretty smart in order to do a couple of those things. So that's kind of an open-ended question that remains, and the latest effort. And then the other one is hearkening back once more to the Lori Vallow Daybell case. There was some delayed discovery disclosures from the state in that case. They were repeat and also leading up to about 2 weeks ahead of her trial. Interesting, in that case, she never waived her speedy trial right, whereas Bryan Kohberger did, to grant additional time to his defense to build the case. That I think we're seeing can be a bit of a double-edged sword. And because of the discovery delays in Lori Vallow Daybell's case, that judge felt his back was against the wall, and he pulled the death penalty as a potential sentence, which was unto itself precedent setting in Idaho. And now we're starting to see, just a year or two later, that that is now something that other defense attorneys are leaning into. Bryan Kohberger's lead attorney, Ann Taylor, not only in this case, but also in another death penalty eligible case, is making the same argument in both cases, that delayed discovery in each separate case should strike the death penalty as a potential sentence.
I know you've been in court with Bryan Kohberger, and a lot has been said about who he was. You even yourself say that people you've interviewed talk about him being a loner. He's been described as, a little bit strange. Now his own defense team is saying that he has autism. What do you observe about his demeanor from the times that you've been in court?
I've told people in the past that I think I could really market a really strong story about, with the headline, "What's it like to be in court with Bryan Kohberger?" And that sounds pretty interesting, right? I bet a lot of people would be curious to read that. And the thing that's, I hate to ruin it for people, but it's rather benign. It's pretty sterile. And what's interesting is in this latest filing about his autism issue, I don't see some of the behaviors that they describe. I haven't, in 2.5 years of attending various hearings over that time, observed any of the behavior that the defense references. Now, I'm not questioning whether or not he has autism. They have medical experts who have reviewed him and maybe even past medical history in order to point to. But what I will tell you is their argument that the death penalty should be struck as a result because he's going to act out during trial, or he's going to have some sort of mannerisms that are going to throw off jurors as they're watching him, or he's not going to show any remorse if he is convicted, and therefore they're going to make determinations about who he is based on his autism. That's a little hard for me to believe based on my personal experiences watching him in court. He is very engaged. He is very observant. He is eyes forward constantly on the judge, digesting all the information. He's speaking with his attorneys during breaks, and he looks very aware of what's going on and has really worked to keep it together. He's not rocking in his chair. He's not fiddling with his hands. He's not doing some of the things that his defense team suggested might be ways in which he'll act out during the physical trial. And so I'll be curious if suddenly we do see those things. But once more, over 2.5 years of observing him closely in the courtroom, I've never seen any of those behaviors.
What do you make of his defense team requesting that he be able to dress out? Every time we see him in court, he's in a suit and tie, which is abnormal, in my experience, at least. The custody defendants come out in their county jumpsuit.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just, security measures, conservation of court efforts and everything else. But they have requested, and it's been granted, that he be allowed to wear a suit every time he's in court, even without a jury present. I'm curious to know your thoughts on what exactly is their strategy behind that, and do you think it's having any effect?
My understanding also is that is fairly abnormal, including in Idaho. And I think that the judge is granting this as a result of understanding the intense publicity that is on this case. And I think that is indisputable, whether it's the live stream or before they removed cameras, whether that was TV or still photos from the courtroom. These images are going across the world. And every time some new court document drops or some new detail or anything, his face is plastered all over the internet, whether that's on YouTube or newspapers or social media. And so, I don't have a personal opinion about it, but I know what the strategy is. And that's that I think once you see somebody, and there have been many studies done about this, if you see somebody who appears to be a criminal, then you're more likely in your brain to believe that they're a criminal. And so I think what the defense is doing is, as you pointed out, they've been litigious, they've been aggressive, they're doing everything they can in order to give him his best shot and create a fair trial scenario, and not have 12 people walk in and have preconceived notions about who this individual is before they hear the evidence.
We've talked about the DNA before. We've talked about the investigative genetic genealogy that was used in finally tying Kohberger as a suspect in this case. This has been challenged in more ways than one by the defense. And one of the ways that they've done that is attacking some of the affidavits and warrants that were used in this case, saying that not all the information was shared with the judge. And there's two things I'm hoping that you could comment on. One is they brought up the fact that no DNA linking the crime scene to Bryan Kohberger was found in either his vehicle or his apartment, which is not without significance, I would say. And then the idea that there was other male unidentified DNA profiles found either inside or outside the home that have not been submitted for testing as to try to identify who those are. Could you walk us through those two arguments being made by the defense?
Sure. So the first part is you're absolutely correct. The day that Kohberger was arrested, December 30th of 2022 in Eastern Pennsylvania, search warrants were served on his student apartment in Pullman, as well actually as his office on campus as a TA. They actually pulled nothing from the office, which was a shared space, but they didn't take anything according to the documents about what was seized. In his apartment, they located some strands of hair, including a dog hair, which is sort of interesting in this case, or at least what was believed to be an animal or dog hair. And then also they found what was presumed by an initial test some blood, one on a pillowcase and then one on some bedding. And neither of those have actually come back up. So, and his defense has said repeatedly in court, no ties to the victims, and no DNA evidence of any of the victims in his apartment. You mentioned the vehicle as well. Police, according to the defense, basically tore the thing apart more than once. They took apart the brake pedal, they took apart the stick shift, they took apart the key fob. They were trying to find anything related to the victims, and again, according to the defense, found nothing. So, as you pointed to, that's not insignificant. That there's nothing tying him to the crime based on those three places and search warrants. And then as far as DNA that was also found at the crime scene at 1122 King Road, the defense has pointed out that there was a glove that was found outside of the property, which had some amount of trace unknown male blood DNA is really the key there. And then also inside the home, the 3-story property, between the first and second floors on one of the handrails, there was some sort of blood spot that was discovered by police. The defense has asked repeatedly, why has this not been tested in the same way that the DNA on the knife sheath was discovered or tested rather? And part of it from the state prosecutor is that it did not meet the criteria, according to him, in order to submit to the FBI database known as CODIS. And I believe my understanding on that is that if you submit one piece of evidence from a crime scene, you're not really permitted to on the others, in part because it would kick the other one out of the system, which they want to maintain that as a potential perpetrator. And the criteria also requires that if you're going to submit anything to that, it has to be the perceived perpetrator behind the DNA that you submit. And the lead detective in the case from Moscow Police said on the stand in a closed hearing, which we received a transcript of now, he said that they prioritized the knife sheath, given this was a stabbing crime and they had this incredible piece of evidence, and they really prioritized that, believing that it was belonging to the weapon used in this crime.
That's a perfect way to bring us to one of the last kind of twists and turns in the litigation leading up to the eventual trial in this case, is that given that all of their attempts to keep this DNA out, as I said before, they have either got to legally prevent it from being admissible as evidence, or they've got to come up with an innocent explanation for why their client's DNA ends up on that knife sheath. The latest development that we have is it's now believed that the defense is going to go ahead and admit that that DNA is their client's. Again, they're not tied to this. They could change course at trial, I suppose. But it seems like their current strategy will be to say that that is, in fact, his DNA, trace DNA, not blood DNA, or what we would call touch DNA, was recovered on that knife sheath, but that it was planted. And I'm curious as to what has been the reaction from the prosecution. Has the defense provided any more insight into how they believe that would be planted? And if planted, because planted is certainly a loaded term, planted by whom?
Right. So we learned this information actually through a prosecution filing. And the way that they are coming to that determination is that the defense has not offered up any expert witnesses on their behalf who are going to challenge that it's Bryan Kohberger's DNA. So they're making a bit of a presumption here, but they're saying you don't have anybody according to your list and what their potential testimony will be who is going to allege that it is not his DNA. And so at a hearing in January, Kohberger's lead attorney, again, Ann Taylor, she made that exact point. She said, this is the ultimate issue in this case with regard to the DNA. How did it get there is basically what she was saying. What does a sheath at a scene mean is what she said in court. And that will be the thing they need to try to explain most. And so she was saying, essentially, could this have been placed there? And so through this state filing, they're arguing that it appears that Kohberger's defense will be arguing that it was planted. It doesn't prove that he was ever actually in the home. Perhaps there's another way in which something that he once touched related to what is believed to be the murder weapon, which we still don't know if police have acquired, by the way. We just don't know. It's never been released if they found it, or what they believe it to be anyway. How do you explain away how this related item ends up in the home with his DNA on it?
Going back to the alibi issue, the defense early on, in fact, there was a requests and pressure by the prosecution for them to actually produce alibi evidence, if that's what they were going to argue. And the most that we've ever heard is this idea that he was out, that he liked to drive late at night, and one of the things he liked to do was look at the stars, and that this is kind of becoming the stargazing alibi defense in this case. Where does that stand now, and what is the prosecution's position on, if in fact that is the defense theory, what they expect the defense to have to do to back that up?
Even when this first was presented the very first time with the original district judge, he also noted that this did not meet Idaho's requirements to make an alibi argument. And in our state here, you do have to submit that information ahead of time. You can't surprise anybody and say, but wait, he's got an alibi. They have not provided any corroborating evidence about him being out. In fact, I think the best piece of information or data they've provided is that his cell phone will show that historically, including in the month of the homicides, he would often go out late at night, drive by himself. This became habitual. And there was a particular park in southeastern Washington that he would frequent, and including to look at the stars and the moon. Again, people have pointed out that is not quite the argument they have made about that night, but they also say that he has photos on his phone that show that this was something a bit of a hobby, but they have never said that he has photos from that night of the moon and the stars. And even people have looked at the weather report that day, and it was overcast and fog. I'm not sure you could have even seen those things. So the state has challenged that repeatedly. The judge initially said, he called it an alibi, a so-called alibi, and they refiled. The state continued to reject that and say, well, great, we already knew that he was out and about. You're basically proving part of our case. He was awake, he was out. And they have filed in the motions in limine that no additional information can be provided about that at this stage, because the state would have to investigate it, and they don't have time to do so 4 or 5 months out from trial. And they said, if he wants to make that argument, then he's going to have to get on the stand, and he's going to have to make it himself and corroborate it and speak directly to it. And as you know, there's always quite the risk if you put the alleged suspect, the defendant, on the trial or on the stand, what door that opens up for cross-examination and anything else. So the defense has pushed back on that, and they have objected to that. But once more, we are still in that process with the motions in limine, and we head toward April 9th, and we'll see if Judge Stephen Hippler allows even that information in, or if no alibi will be submitted at trial.
Where do things stand now? What do we expect to take place before trial? And do we still expect trial to take place when they've set that trial for?
Trial is set for this summer. Judge Stephen Hippler seems pretty hell-bent on maintaining that schedule. Right now, we're in the motions in limine process. We've had the initial filings from both sides. They'll debate this during oral arguments, and that's scheduled for April 9th, which is Kohberger's next scheduled appearance in court here in Boise. And the newest wrinkle, as we discussed, though, is that the defense has filed these two death penalty strike motions. What's curious about that is the opportunity for filing those, the deadline passed months ago. So how this judge, who's known as a bit of a stickler, is going to respond and handle that is curious. I mean, perhaps he schedules another hearing for that issue individually. I think the tactic from a defense standpoint may be to try to delay the trial to some extent. I mean, probably not a significant amount through those filings, but we'll see how the judge, how he receives that. And from there, jury selection is scheduled to start July 30th. It's anticipated that thousands of people from the community will be called in. It will take a week and a half to 2 weeks is, again, what's anticipated. And trial is scheduled for August 11th.
Kevin, I cannot thank you enough. This has been such an enjoyable conversation. You are a wealth of knowledge. Like you have lived this case for the last couple of years from the onset. And thank you so much for sharing all of your insights.
Thanks very much.
With the trial looming, all eyes are now on what unfolds next in the courtroom. For the victims' families, it's about finding answers and ultimately justice for Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan. As the legal process moves forward, the case continues to raise difficult questions and intense public interest. But at its core, this remains about 4 young lives lost far too soon and the pursuit of accountability for what happened that terrifying night in a small college town. Thank you for joining us for this special presentation of Courtroom Confidential Case Notes.